Hi, everyone. This is Jason Jordan. Thank you for joining us for the webinar today. It's just at the top of the hour here. So let me start by introducing the topic here. So there's an interesting thing that I've noticed, and I've started to see this pop up all over the place, which is there's generally this realization coming that one size fits all strategy doesn't work. And I think even more specifically, as you can see here, we're talking specifically about a one size fits all sales methodology. And and I'm fortunate to know a lot of really bright people. And I had two conversations earlier in the year that brought us to this point. As many of you know, Dr. Leff Bonney who's from Florida State, has joined Vantage, and we've put together a service offering called Agile Sales Code. And I'll let Leff explain that in a minute. But basically, it comes down to there's a very situational way to view how you approach the market. And then separately, I was having a conversation with Tim Riesterer, who is at Corporate Visions, and basically came to the conclusion that we had very similar ways of thinking about this. And Corporate Visions takes it more from the messaging side, whereas Vantage takes it more from the methodology or process or skill side. And so I thought it might be interesting to just get these two guys together on the horn here and just have a little discussion about where this concept came from, how they approach it, how their two ideas are different and similar. So let's go to introduction here. So I'm Jason Jordan. I'm a partner with Vantage. I'll be hosting these other two gentlemen today. The first, as I mentioned, is Tim Riesterer, who's the Chief Strategy Officer with Corporate Visions, which is an amazing company that's had truly amazing success in the marketplace. And then Leff Bonney, who is a professor at Florida State University. He runs their Sales Institute, and as I mentioned, has joined Vantage, and we have kind of co-developed a really interesting training program. So, Tim, I don't know that I did Corporate Visions justice. Do you want to add anything to my description there?
No, you did fine, and more will come out as we talk through the webcast. But yes, the customer conversation, the actual moment your lips are moving in front of a customer, the story you tell, and then the skill to tell that story is where we focus.
Great. Leff, do you want to say anything about Florida State or your role here at Vantage?
Yeah, so as a lot of people know, universities are finally sort of waking up to the importance of sales as an area of teaching and study. And so at FSU, we're proud to be one of the first and quickly growing sales centers in the United States. And we've been able to gain a lot of interesting insights through working through companies at the institute there. So look forward to sharing some of those insights today on the call.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to facilitate this conversation, but try to not talk too much, and basically just have a series of questions I'm going to pose to Tim and Leff, and let them respond. So let's start out with a simple question here, but I think this is a very profound question. What's wrong with the existing sales methodologies? And so sales methodologies have been around forever. They probably came into true prominence in the 70s and 80s when Neil Rackham and some others were doing all this amazing research. But Leff, I think it's your research that shows that 51% of sales leaders are not happy with their sales methodology or their sales process. They're disappointed in the results. And so this is kind of like CRM in my mind, that everyone's got a sales methodology. Everyone's been trying desperately to get it to work and to maximize the value of it, but people are still frustrated by it. And so I think that you both are going to provide some insights. But let me just start with that. I mean, what is wrong with existing sales methodologies such that after all this effort, more than half of sales leaders are still upset with it?
Yeah, so thanks, Jason. So, again, in true academic form, I'd like to sort of answer the question by just highlighting very quickly, a study that we did as a part of our journey at FSU into this idea of sales methodology. It's often academics are sort of accused of proving the obvious or doing research projects that sort of that highlight things that sales managers or sales leaders already knew. And I'm curious if people would get the same reaction out of this study, given that in some ways what I'm about to share seems kind of obvious, but yet we still see the same mistakes sort of over and over again. So if you'll go one slide forward, Jason, we'll talk a little bit about the study. Back in the fall of 2012, we were sort of asked to take a look at some methodologies and what would work well and what was working well and not in the marketplace. So one of the studies that we did, we had about 1,500 salespeople in the sample, They were from three different companies or in three very different industries. And what we did is we wanted to see, is there such a thing as a sales strategy, and do the tactics that make up those strategies really tend to sort of hang together when a salesperson is involved in a scenario? So what we did is, as people can see here, and I didn't list all 16 tactics. I didn't want to start a debate about whether we had all the right tactics in the mix, but we identified 16 tactics that we felt salespeople sort of had at their disposal. I've put a few in here just to give people a flavor of what we were talking about in terms of something like the needs discovery process. We would consider a tactic, or presenting the value of a particular product or service I would consider a tactic. And so what we did, Jason, is we gave people sort of scenario one, and we asked people just simply in this scenario, and these scenarios were very specific to the industries in the study, what would you do here? And salespeople went through and sort of picked the tactics that they would use in that particular scenario. And then we went on to scenario two, and we asked, what would you do here? And then finally repeated that for a third scenario, where we said, now tell us across these 16 tactics what you would do. The findings were really interesting, because what we found in sort of the low performing salespeople is that there was no discernible pattern in terms of what low performers were trying to do in some of these situations. But average performers tended to sort of pick a fixed strategy and apply it across all three scenarios. So I'm not saying this is the actual strategy, but just as an example, what we found was that in each company in the study, the average performers would have sort of a set of common tactics, and moving from one scenario to the next, or one situation to the next in the study, they would apply the same set of selling tactics to it. What was interesting was high performers, on the other hand, use 2 to 3 different strategies across different scenarios. So what I mean is, in scenario number one, we might have had a strategy that looked like this, and what we saw was high performers more times than not were using a pattern like this in scenario number one. In scenario number two, they were using a different pattern, but consistently across high performers, a pattern was being used. And then in scenario three, still a third. And so sort of the moral of the story here is that the average performers take a routine and stick to it. High performers are using a different yet consistent set of tactics that's adjusting to the situation. So quite simply, in pure academic, normal patterns of an academic here, I've maybe in a long-winded way said what we already knew to be true. The high performers are changing what they're doing across those scenarios, and average performers are sticking to one pattern or one strategy. And so what I think that means, Jason, to answer your question, why are sales methodologies broken? It's because they're teaching a one-size-fits-all, which we know if you're trying to help a low performer become an average performer, that might be an okay strategy to invoke. But if we really want to move our sales organizations forward, we have to take on the hard but possible task of saying, let's train people to approach different situations with different strategies. And in this case, I'm using strategies synonymously with methodologies.
Right.
So, Tim, do you have thoughts here?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense now when you look at it, right? But you're right. The last 30 years have been primarily focused on which methodology should we put in place so that we help our managers cultivate a common nomenclature and expectation among salespeople so that we can track, let's say, pipeline accurately, or leverage a piece of technology. And so it seems like the motivation to get a single methodology in place was producing something that was, like you said, good for average performers, or maybe even to organize a company to a common nomenclature and tracking method, but it wasn't unleashing, if you will, the power of sales performers to adjust to, adapt to, and respond to the different selling situations. What we've discovered in the last couple of years is that one of the things companies have been trying to do to, let's say, make their process or methodology more flexible, despite it being one size fits all. Hey, we do strategic selling, we do solution selling, we do spin selling, you name it, right? They're like, we need to flex this a little bit. And in my slide here, one of the things that we saw them trying to flex to was, let's introduce the idea of personas. And so we should address each persona So let's make sure they're all in the opportunity. Let's make sure we're mapping the deal and all the personas we have to speak to. And let's figure out how to address each persona's needs. So as a company that helps other companies build stories and then their salespeople tell those stories, the research that we did landed on frankly some interesting old science that we pulled forward, and that's this concept of fundamental attribution error. And so what we were seeing is companies getting into the business of personalizing their approach by the persona, the individual. So any given sales call or opportunity would have a little sheet filled out for the CIO, the CFO, the user buyer, the business decider buyer. And this example I have here is, let's pretend that a company's selling marketing automation to another company. So I'm one of the marketing automation vendors, and I'm targeting multiple personas. So the one adjustment we've seen in sales methodologies to include personas now, but what we're discovering is that this effort to personalize to persona has not been producing the results they were hoping for either. And the reason we could point that out, the reason for that is the psychology of decision making that says that it's actually the company's situation that they're in that is a better indicator of why they should change and whether they'll change than their dispositions or those personas. So fundamental attribution error says that we as humans tend to put way too much emphasis on people's dispositions, and I equate that to personas, and underemphasize their situations as predictors of whether or not they're going to do something or behave a certain way or change their mind and make a different decision. And what that really looks like is that when you personalize to different personas and try to reach them uniquely, you actually lower the performance of your sale, because the thing that drives a decision is what situation they're in. So when we say sales methodologies are one size fits all, what they're not taking into account is the situation of the customer. And let me just give you one quick example here with this picture in front of you. If you're targeting a business with your marketing automation content, and you target a CMO, and you say that CMO wants to get a better measure of ROI of their marketing programs, that's interesting, but the story that you have to tell is totally different if that CMO has brand new marketing automation installed recently from one of your competitors, or that CMO has 10-year-old marketing automation installed, or that CMO is still using spreadsheets and recipe cards or some other technique. What we discovered is that the primary impetus for making a change is the installed situation that your challenges or missed opportunities created by that installed situation many more times than your persona. Because an ROI story to a CMO is dramatically different based on what they've got installed, in other words, their current situation, than an ROI story to a CMO if they have a different situation. But most people are going to these titles with generic stories, regardless of their situation, and they're like, why are my personas not working? And bottom line is you have to be situationally fluent, and the thing that all of these personas share in common that will drive their decision is their installed situation. So sales methodologies were missing that entire thing. In an effort to fix themselves with personas to be more fluent, they ended up not fixing the ultimate problem, which is being situationally relevant. I hope that made sense, Leff.
Yeah, well, so this is Jason. This is one of those things that once you have it in your mind, you see it everywhere. It's like you see pieces and parts and everything points to the fact that we've just gotten this all wrong, right? We've tried to implement a methodology and we've struggled to get our sales team to do it, and our sales team abandons it, and it's probably because a lot of times it doesn't work. It's like the data that comes out that says buyers are now more than halfway through their buying process by the time they encounter salespeople. Well, in some situations, yes. In some situations, no. And it's a perfect example of having a rigid process that's not accommodating the simplest idea that some buyers are sophisticated and have been doing research, and some really need consultation. And so it's so completely accurate. Let me just move forward a little bit and pose another question, because I think this is actually as interesting as it gets, is to try to understand how you all came to your respective models. And so, I mean, so the problem is that we have been struggling for decades to implement one-size-fits-all strategies, approaches, methodologies, processes, messaging, however you want to define it. And it's just not the reality of how people buy. People buy in different ways based on the situation they're in, and we have to accommodate ourselves to that, not vice versa. So, Tim, let me start with you on this one. So, what was Corporate Vision's path to this realization that it's really driven by situations, not personas, and not industries, and not customer types?
Yeah, being that I'm not the doctor, professor, PhD on the call, I just play one on webcast. I need to first invoke our research partners. So the work that I'm about to describe or have been talking about is work that we've done in conjunction with a couple of professors that you see here with competing schools to Florida State, but I'm sure not, nearly as stellar as Florida State Leff. But the work we've done with these guys, they're social scientists, behavioral scientists. They look at what I call the invisible forces that shape human decision making, how people frame value and how they make choices. And so what we've done in order to figure out how to better accommodate situational fluency, which seems to be sort of the thing we're all trying to achieve, is try to understand how customers make decisions based on the situations they're in. So these are the sciences that we study and with our scientists, and we do some experimentation. So in the next slide, you'll see that we look at existing science, something like fundamental attribution error or status quo bias or anchoring effect or picture superiority effect, loss aversion. Name a piece of science that has been demonstrated out in the clinical journals. And what you're going to find is decades of science that talk about how people make decisions. The interesting thing about that science, it's mostly been published by professors who, no offense, Leff, have done a lot of their work on grad students or gamblers or convicts. They try to find audiences that are captive and willing to do something for very little money. What we do with these scientists is we run simulations. So if you build out the slide, Jason, we do exclusive simulation testing where we put would-be B2B buyers, not salespeople, but decision people on the other end of a set of test conditions, different messages, different messaging frameworks, and different ways to communicate story. And then we watch how they react. And in the simulation, the choices they make and the intensity with which they make those choices and decisions. So we don't literally ask them sort of their opinion. We actually ask them to make certain choices and rate the intensity of those things. And those results, if you build out the next one, Jason, in frameworks. And we're going to talk a little bit in this program about the frameworks to build a better story, a situational story based on where the customer is in their buying journey and what their situation is and the questions they're asking themselves and the questions salespeople must help them answer. And it's not just to build a better story, it's then to have the skill to tell that story. Because if you're going to tell a different story for a situation than you would tell for the other situation, there's typically a matching set of skills to tell that story, as we'll talk about. So for us, it was a matter of what's the human decision-making science? And when you put customers in a certain situation, how do they react? And then based on that, we've been able to build situation-based frameworks and skills to help build better stories and tell better stories according to the customer situation. And we'll get into that in a little more detail, but that's where all our work comes from. So when you say, where does your situation-based solution come from? It comes from this work.
Well, I really think it's brilliant to start connecting the dots with all this research that's been done on human behavior and human decision making, and it's kind of interesting when you come to a conclusion, you look back, you see all the data, right? I mean, you're like, oh, of course this makes sense because for 20 years we've known it in the academic world, we just never applied it in the business world. And I think it's the same with some of Leff's thinking. I mean, there's been a lot of research that shows the adaptability of salespeople has been, over time, one of the sole indicators of top performance. But Leff, let me use that as a transition to you. I mean, how did you end up with your insights that the situation thing is where it's at?
Sure. And before I do that, I just want to quickly say to Tim, as someone who's been a grad student, Tim, we often have to gamble and commit crimes to be able to pay for grad school. So your research with grad students, gamblers, and convicts makes total sense as a homogenous sample, as we would say in academics.
I didn't see a
Yeah,
entry on your LinkedIn profile, Leff.
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Oh, there must be a gap there. I got to go back and inspect that closer.
Yeah, I'll fill that in after the webinar. But hey, so yeah, I mean, we didn't really mean to go down this path. I mean, that was kind of the interesting part about the journey that we went on with some folks in the academic world that I've done some of this research with. As I was mentioning earlier, FSU is one of the places that is engaging the corporate world to learn more about sales. We really do work very hard not to be an ivory tower academic, sales institute. And so we engage our partners very closely to sort of say, hey, I know you want to recruit our students, but also what do you want to know about from an insight standpoint? And so, 5-6 years ago, we were asked to sort of say, can you help us make sense of this methodology landscape? Everyone's writing a book that says, here's the way you're supposed to sell. Some of them being so bold as to put some titles that I think are fun to poke a little fun at, with the things like Sales Bible and the greatest book ever written. And, people do a great job sort of highlighting their methodologies, but there's so many of them out there that it causes confusion in the marketplace. So we had our sales leaders who sponsor the FSU Institute sort of ask, can we make some sense of this? And so we went on a sort of a research journey where we said, can we do some studies that actually sort of highlight some of this? So in the summer of 12, we did a study we call our seller type study. And that's where we just went out and asked salespeople, can you tell us what kind of seller you are? And, people sort of just checked a box saying, I think I'm like this or I'm like that in terms of a seller. And what came to light through that process was that was a difficult exercise, especially for high performing salespeople who consider themselves situational. And you're asking them to indicate what kind of seller they are, they couldn't do it. And so from that study, we launched the second one, which we sort of call the situational study. And the idea there was to take a look at, so what are reps doing in terms of strategies in different situations? And this was the study I highlighted earlier, where again, the aha was there are some standard, we believe, I say standard, I guess I should say consistent strategies across companies. So consultative selling, for example, that is a strategy that we see sellers deploy across, almost no matter what the industry. People are trying that as a sales process, most likely because that's what most training programs are sort of rooted in. There's a disruptive selling strategy where people are really trying to shake customer thinking. We believe that to be true. And so in that study, we found that there really were sort of different strategies being used. And more importantly, as I already highlighted, high performers change the strategy across situations where your average performer tends to sort of stick with one. The other thing we wanted to do is we said, well, hey, if we can identify some common strategies across companies and across industries, can we also identify common situations? So that was really sort of the driver of study 3 that we did in the spring of 13. And what we found was we actually couldn't. In other words, it would be great if we could say that everyone has a transactional customer and a consultative, strategic customer, which I'm sure we could say that those exist. But is that it? I mean, is that really as descriptive as we can get around some of these situations? And what we found was where the situations truly were unique to the industry. So as Tim was pointing out, sort of the situation of what kind of technology has someone who's in the market for marketing automation, what kind of technology do they have in place? That's relevant in the marketing space, but it's not relevant in necessarily if you were selling healthcare products. And so the idea is that these situations that companies face truly are unique to them. And so I think we have to be very aware of that. We can't write a book that says, in this situation, do this strategy, because those situations are unique. And then in the summer of 13, we sort of said, could we take this idea of strategies and the process of identifying situations and sort of help companies use that to get better? And so we started out just looking to see if could we make sense of the methodology space, and sort of stumbled in, I would say, to the opportunity of sort of helping people be agile and more situational in their selling approach.
So I just love the research. I mean, to your point, there's so many sales methodologies, and everyone replaces one thinking the next is going to be the silver bullet. And the realization that they probably all work sometimes, but none of them work all the time is insightful. Let's just get down to some nuts and bolts here. let's talk about how the approach that you've come up with actually works. So, lift the hood and let's see exactly what's going on. And Tim, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. Um, so what ultimately we've been able to discern with the help of our research partners and the work into human decision making is that's really what selling becomes. It's not selling, it's deciding, and it's not the seller deciding, it's the customer deciding. And these questions are not rocket science, but what we discovered might be sort of the breakthrough. We think that there's a question that must be answered for every new prospect that you address, which is not should I buy you and why should I buy you, but why should I change and why should I do anything different? Most companies go after new prospects thinking they're trying to compare their product to the incumbent product, when in reality, you're trying to figure out, the customer's trying to figure out why should I change or do anything different. Your enemy is gravity and inertia, not a competitor in a competitive matrix. So answering the question, why should I change and do something different? What we were able to discern is that the enemy is something called status quo bias, the proclivity of people to keep doing the same thing. And we identified 4 causes of status quo bias and figured out that you have to deliberately address the 4 causes of status quo bias. In other words, defeat those 4 causes in order to acquire new customers, convince them to leave their incumbent, change and do something different. Well, we got the question. The next question that somebody asked us right away is, well, what about if you are the incumbent? What if you are the status quo? What if we need to renew all these customers? So then we did a study with our scientists again, and lo and behold, what we discovered is you can't take the same approach. That in fact, taking that disruptive, provocative, driven, why change approach with an existing customer gives you the exact opposite reaction. So when you have an existing customer and you're looking to renew them, in other words, you're not trying to defeat status quo bias because you are the status quo. In fact, you're trying to defend status quo bias. You're trying to reinforce status quo bias. So we discovered that if you try to challenge or provoke or disrupt existing customers during a renewal process, you will actually increase the likelihood of switching and decrease the likelihood of renewing. And so in fact, the 180-degree opposite thing you want to have happen. So guess what? We found that there were 2 specific situations you knew you had to message to and build stories, and 2 different types of skill sets between customer acquisition and customer retention. Well, then another question was asked. Customers were like, well, one of the big challenges we have with existing customers is getting them to pay more, communicate a price increase, because our existing customers became existing customers sometimes because we beat our competitor on price, or now we want to get more money out of them. Well, it turns out that if you try to communicate a price increase using why change disruptive, provocative methods, you have a much less likelihood of getting the price increase. In fact, you increase the likelihood of seeking out discounted competitors. Whereas if you reinforce status quo bias, you get them to pay more. So there's science that says situationally, renewals and existing customer price increases should be talked about, communicated, and skillfully delivered one way versus when you're trying to prospect and acquire new customers. The next question we got was, we have a lot of constipated pipeline. In other words, a lot of deals stuck somewhere in the middle of our pipeline, and they're not coming out the other end. And we need to loosen that up, create a sense of urgency, get decisions, not deferrals. So when we did that research and we created different messaging scenarios, lo and behold, primarily, again, this was with companies making a decision to do something new or different, you needed to take a more aggressive, defeat the status quo approach, a more emotional business change story in order to get people to make a decision now, not later. So there are scenarios or situations that you're in that require situation-specific messaging and skills. Then the next question somebody asked was sort of funny. It was kind of a hybrid question, and it turns out the results were kind of quasi-hybrid. They said, great, now that you've answered all these questions, what about an upsell? So we had several clients who have installed bases of equipment or software that are many years old, and their customers are just happy, keeping on. And they're like, how do we get them to move? And it turns out that we were able to discover that you need to do a fair bit of reinforcing their status quo bias towards you and the impact you've had with them and the familiarity you have with them, mixed with a little bit of disruption and provocation. So what's interesting about this, as you see it, is we can now look at organizations, look at the selling situation, look at what they're hoping to sell in that situation, and pick a framework and build a story and teach the specific skills to tell that kind of story to accomplish your goals. So now it's no longer about what's the selling process that we use every time. It's like, what's the selling story and skills we need to sell and tell that story for the situation we're in, the solution we're selling, and where that customer's at, or where that prospect's at, and where the deal's at. So it becomes a fundamentally different way to think about communicating and having customer conversations, to think about the questions you must answer and how the psychology of answering that question is different depending on the situation. Yeah, sorry, one more slide, Bill. And one of the things that we found interesting is everybody, 70 to 80% of revenue and anticipated revenue comes from the right-hand side of this, whereas 70 to 80% of the investment most companies make is on the left-hand side, customer acquisition. So we think there's potential. And so as a result, they've been using a one-size-fits-all approach. They're using the same approach to acquisition in their expansion activities and situations. And they're putting the greatest amount of revenue at risk by not using a tailored situational approach.
Yeah, and this resonates with me. This is Jason, so much, Tim, because it gets back to your persona argument that you opened with. I'm a marketer to an extent, and so when we think about messaging, we're almost always thinking about it to a persona. Like, how do you message to a CIO versus how do you message to a trainer? And if we go a step farther, we go, okay, well, what industry is this? And we start thinking about how you would message uniquely to that industry, and it's almost always focused on acquiring new customers. And there's
we
no one
never asked the question, what's your
underappreciated
situation? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So at a minimum, you maybe have to add another layer to a persona. Are they an existing customer, or are they a competitive customer? Because the psychology is clearly different. And I would argue the psychology of who they're working with and what they're currently doing and how they're doing it today is way more potent than the title they have and the industry they're in.
And so this is what Corporate Visions does for clients, is help them sort all this, right?
Yep, sort it out and build stories and tell stories accordingly. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, Leff, let's let you strut your stuff here. So how exactly does the Agile Sales Code methodology work generally?
Yeah, so in some ways, this is a slide that's a nice way to just sort of put process around, I think, what some of the things that Tim was saying, not to say Corporate Visions doesn't have a process, but in some ways he's sort of showing, I think, outcomes that can come of this thinking. And what I mean by that is, to get to the point where we can know what kind of customer are we dealing with, what kind of situation are they in, then to come up with not only what is it the right message, but what are some strategies we need? Because our view on it is messaging is important, and having people say the right thing is important. Sometimes there are activities they need to do, and sometimes some of those activities are even internal. So we take a look at strategy from the lens of it's not just message, it's also things we have to get our salespeople to do or get the customer to do as they move through their journey, and we got to be able to train to that. So what we're seeing on the screen here is just sort of a nice process of thinking through, and this actually sort of comes from the military in terms of thinking through how would a military get a special forces unit ready to go, and deploy into the field. Well, the first thing they would do is say, okay, if you're going to go into this theater of action, here's the likely scenarios you might face, whether it's pirates off the coast of Somalia or people holding terrorists in a major urban center. We need to paint those scenarios. And in sales lingo, I think we need to paint the scenarios of what are some common patterns we see, or common patterns of situations we see our customers in. And once we identify those common patterns, then we can come back and say, now what are we going to do? What are the strategies we're going to use? What kind of message do we need to deliver? But also, what are some of those more tactical activities that we need? And if we can identify those two things, then we can build a training program. I'm just sort of always in awe of people who try to work this backwards. of let's try to find a training program that aligns with the tactics we think are important for the situations that we face. I mean, what are the odds that there is a commercial training program sitting on the shelf out there ready to go for your tactics in your situations? It should flow the way this diagram's laid out. Once we build the training program, then we have to build agility sustainment. What I like to say is making sure it's reinforced and becomes the everyday vocabulary of the people that are getting this. So if you'll hit the bill, Jason, here are the things in terms of Vantage Point's approach to that. We sort of see multiple deliverables here that are important. That we need to build that situation and the strategy, sort of the intel report, if you will, on the situations. We need to be able to then help out build those guides and get some of those strategies and tactics right. And we're using what high performers in that company are doing to accomplish that. Then we build the training program, and yes, we do have some IP on the shelf that helps with some of the skill side of it, but we tailor the training, to accomplish those strategies or activate those strategies. And then finally, we work with the client to sort of think about what does your learning ecosystem look like, and how can we make sure this is sustained across, not just some live event that happened in the classroom, but for 6, 8, 12 months in advance, this thing continues to build momentum.
So, Leff, I know your research pretty well, obviously, since we collaborated on some of the stuff. But I love the examples. I mean, the places you looked for reference here, as you pointed out, weren't in sales. You looked at military, you looked at medical professionals, you looked at sports, right? Places where they have to assess the situation. It's like if a head of sales ran a hospital, everyone would get penicillin. It's
That's
like,
right.
Guy comes in and like he's bleeding out. Just give him some penicillin. That's what we've chosen as our approach to patient care. It's like when we start to think about it, it just makes total sense that we can't expect a single training program that we've gotten that's a one size fits all solution to handle every situation we encounter. But I mean, no one else does except for sales. So it kind of,
I mean, you look at Jason, you look at all elite organizations on the planet, where sports teams, military, hospital, all the ones you mentioned. They don't have the perfect strategy. They have the perfect process for building strategy. And what I mean by that is they have a process that allows for us to build flexible strategies, as opposed to we're going to come up with one and hope everyone runs it to perfection every single time, because that may work. And like you said, 20% of the situations, but the rest of the time that's not effective.
Yep.
Well, and I think, Leff, this is Tim and Jason, a question for you guys in a commentary. Really, when I saw this research, that's why I'm like literally raised my head and said, we got to compare notes, because at some point there's the importance of a strategy to follow for a given situation. And then at some point you get in front of the customer and your story must sort of line up, right? And so your lips have to move, I always say. And there's such a complement between identifying your strategies, right? How, you might have 3 or 4 different ones based on the situations you sell in. And then for each one, then having the messaging content and the storytelling skills to complement that strategy. So I really like the premise that organizations, because we found this out when they have a one-size-fits-all sales process, and we're coming in with these different stories for different moments. They're like, how do I align that to my sales process? I'm like, well, there's the problem. Your sales process is rigid and singular and is right only a certain percentage of the time. We're trying to create messaging and skills that align to situations so that they're right 100% of the time. So I guess my question is, on average, when you go into a company and do this assessment, how many situations or strategies will companies typically find? So as a result, if one size fits all, how often is it right? If I have a one size fits all approach, am I right half the time? Am I right 25% of the time? Because I'm not wrong 100% of the time, but like, what are the odds? What do you guys give it when you get in there and look at this?
Yeah, great question, Tim. Obviously it varies company to company. I'd say on average across the client engagements we've worked on, it's been somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 unique situations. And so if we've trained a one size fits all methodology, usually that methodology that they've built works in one of those 4 to 6. So the odds are somewhere in the 18 to 25% chance if I apply this strategy, it's going to work. which isn't that far off, I think, when you look at sort of historical close rates across, if we took close rates across every industry, every sales rep in every industry, a 25 to 30% close rate makes some sense. So I think
Well, now
the
it makes
data sort
sense,
of starts to
right?
bear that.
Now it makes sense because they were probably only using the right approach that many times. So fascinating. So I love this stuff. Good job.
Well, let's go a step farther then. I thought it'd be interesting to let each of you talk about examples of some work you've done, kind of building on the explanation you just gave. Tim, you want to start with an example or two about how you've actually done this with clients? I think going through the example will add a lot of clarity. And
Yeah, for sure. And I think this will be interesting because I've got two examples I want to share, but it's from the same company. Because what happens is, to our point is, there's different situations inside of a company, and are your salespeople ready and optimized to handle that situation? So we had an organization that we're working with that had, in one case, they were having a new product while they were having two product launches. And the first product launch was a brand new product that was going after a strong incumbent. So the incumbent had 75 to 80% market share. So that meant the sellers had to be spun up on a story, and they had to have the skills to tell that story. Well, in this case, they were going to be meeting with a decision maker where they had to disrupt the status quo bias because there was an entrenched competitor. So they had to tell a very compelling, very provocative why change story, and why change now, not later. And so you had to create the emotional energy and urgency for the customer to leave their status quo, and also justify that so they would see not only the need to do something different, but do it now. And building that story is one thing, and then telling that story is another. So we were building a message and skills playbook to go in and accomplish this when they were faced with this selling situation. So now let's go to the next slide, because the very same company in that very same year, this year, 2018, also had an existing product where they were the dominant shareholder. So in one case, you could be going to the institution you're calling on, and in the morning you could be dealing with a competitor who's entrenched and you're trying to disrupt. In the afternoon, you might be talking to a different buyer in that organization where your product, in this case, was the installed incumbent, where it was 85% market share. And so the story there was, how do we make sure we don't lose market share? And they really had two other things they were trying to do: introduce some incremental advances to continue to keep their competitive position afloat, as well as communicate a price increase. We were not going to give them a why change, why now story, when really the story is, why should I stay with you? Why do you got my back? And why should I pay more? And the story, and as a result, the skills to tell that story are different. In fact, they're 180 degrees different. And the same salesperson on the same day could walk into the same building and have two different meetings, and they would look diametrically opposed. And so if you use the same story framework for all of your product launches, and you use then the same skills to tell that story for all your product launches, you are missing an entire opportunity. In fact, creating potential problems for yourself, not recognizing the situation the salesperson is going to encounter, and making sure your story and the skills to tell that story match that situation. And so we have seen dramatic difference in their ability to penetrate against the competitor, which is entrenched, and make sure they've been able to protect and hold their ground by giving them different messaging and skills to tell those stories.
fascinating. And as everything that you said, it makes sense once you
Once you look at it, right? You kind of make a picture of it and show a simple picture, and everybody goes, yeah. And sometimes they may even think they're doing it. This is what I find. And then when you look at the messaging and you look at the process they go through, and then you look at the skills the salespeople have been trained on, it's the same approach in both cases. When in reality, the science shows us the psychology is 180 degrees different. So let's embrace that. Now that we know we have frameworks to do that, we can help folks dramatically change that with dramatically different results.
So we're getting close on time here. I do want to have time to get some questions. Let me just skip over some of this left, and let me turn to you on this one. I mean, what are the challenges here? I mean, let's say we buy into this, right? So we say, okay, we got a methodology. It's pretty rigid. We know that our top performers are a little more adaptable to what the situations are they're encountering. Our poor performers aren't. Um, so I buy into that, and I can believe that the approach is to, identify the situations and then figure out the approach and the messaging, and then train the salespeople and sales managers, how to navigate those common situations. So what's the problem here? What speed bumps are we going to run into?
Well, I think first of all, when you take a look at it, it all starts with the idea that we have to think about the situations, right? And when you think about how most people go about thinking through methodology or say even sales training, they start with what does the methodology or the training need to look like first, and they almost have it backwards. And so I think it all starts with this idea of we have to be more situational in our organizations, whether you own the training function or you own sales enablement, whatever it might be. We have to do something to try to empower our salespeople to understand common situations, because I really am a believer in patterns. Right? There for a while it seemed like every TV show had something to do with analytics and patterns, and there really are such things such that we can use some data and some research processes to go into an organization and say, I really bet, yeah, we can't identify 100% with 100% accuracy situations, but we can probably get to 75 or 80% accuracy in terms of what characteristics should we use to define a situation, and then how can we measure those on every opportunity we're dealing with. But I think companies have to do a better job of sort of trying to make the unknown known around that. And then once we know it, then we can start to think about how do we train situationally. So those situations should be used as important tools to be having our salespeople apply their skills in the training program. In other words, bring those situations into the classroom, or so to speak, so that reps are trained that way. And then finally, Jason, I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart. Managers, if they're given coaching training at all, which unfortunately we still see that as a deficiency across a lot of sales organizations, the idea of talking a manager through coaching somebody through a situation is completely absent from manager training. So they learn oftentimes they learn a coaching framework or a coaching process, but they don't learn how to apply that through a specific situation. And I would even argue that one could make the case managers need their own sort of coaching strategies, because the situations that they're facing as managers are a little different. And so all of that needs to come to a head for managers.
All right, well,
on the backside,
so that's where it starts, right? No, I was going to say that's where it starts. And I mean, you have an assessment tool that you use to identify the situations, and they're different, but I suspect they're pretty intuitive, at least the top one or two. I mean, as people are watching this webcast, I'm sure they're starting to think in their minds, well, what are the situations that I encounter? And it's not that it's hard. What you're saying is that people just don't do it. They don't start there. It's not the way their mind works.
Yeah, that's right. And there is a little bit, you have to be a little careful asking people just off the top of their head, what kind of situations do we face? Because if you go out to the sales force and do that, they tend to tell you the last one they faced, but not necessarily the most common one that they face. And so there is a process that should be applied when you're trying to identify those. And then on the back end, the last thing is these strategies shouldn't be overcomplicated. And I know both Tim and I kind of have heard the same thing from clients of, wow, you're telling me I have to be able to teach my people some multiple methodologies or multiple ways to sell. That sounds complicated, but it doesn't have to be. These strategies can just be 2 or 3 key steps that we want people to do when they execute strategy 1, and 2 or 3 key steps when they execute strategy 2. They do not have to be these overly baked, which oftentimes when we try to build one methodology, that's what we end up with, this overly baked, trying to account for everything situational, one methodology. It looks like an eye chart. When it's finished. It doesn't have to be that way.
That's because the methodology companies need to justify their price. So they got to bake it hard, and they got to bake it deep, and they got to bake it wide, right?
They're paid by the word, right, on the PowerPoint slide. So it's
by the number of steps in your process. Yeah.
That's something we struggle with. I mean, we try to make our content simple, and we've had people look at it and go, "This is too simple." Like, well, that should be the goal, shouldn't it?
Right.
shouldn't the goal be make it easy for your people to execute? Well, so let me move to some questions, because I think I've got one here that's just right on point with where you took that, Leff, and I'll put this to both Tim and Leff, whichever of you wants to take it first. So Jess asks, and this is again what you said. How do you build a process that have enough flex to account for multiple scenarios, but enough consistency to be scalable, measurable, manageable, That's the first place my mind would go to is, if I've got a diverse sales force spanning the globe, how do you practically do this?
So I'll just take it because I was sort of already on that topic, and I think I can just sort of put a bow on my comment, which is this: I'm not saying you shouldn't have a sort of a base foundational way to sell. If consultative is what you've trained your people on, great. How do you take that and just alter it just enough to create what one could consider a new strategy, but one that's applicable to a different situation? In other words, what I mean is build off the strengths of that methodology, but also build new ways or new tactics into that strategy that make it a little more appropriate for the situation. A football team that's a running football team still has pass plays. They just learn to change the formation just enough to make the pass play work. So if you were to take a look at what we call strategies, you'd see there's sort of a foundational strategy in place, and we're making adjustments off of that one to create these, strategy 2, 3, and 4. So it's not new strategies or wholesale changes every single time. So Tim?
Yeah, so we've netted it out a little bit. Like if you think of it as customer acquisition and customer expansion, that would be a great place to start, because the most distinct change in the buyer's psychology, and then how you have to adjust to address the buyer's psychology, is if I have an incumbent competitor of yours and what you got to do to make me change, or if I am your customer and what you need to do to get me to renew, pay more, or buy more from you. So first things first, we say companies should start by having messaging that addresses the customer acquisition, competitive displacement, and one that addresses the customer expansion, renewal, upsell, and price increase. And you'd be a long way ahead of where you were yesterday if you at least looked at those situations as primary drivers or inflection points for changes in your story, and then ultimately the skills to tell that story.
Great. Well, here's another good question. This one's from Nathan, and it's a riff on that a little bit, I guess, which is, how detailed do you need to go with the situations? Is it something simple? And the ideas he gave is disruptor, differentiator, conductor, expander. I mean, how specific do the situations need to be? Either one of you, both of you.
Those are some words I've used in an ebook recently, so I appreciate somebody bringing those back. So when we talk about disruptor and differentiator, and I look at things like, if you have to disrupt and differentiate, that's primarily a why change and why choose me to change with sort of story. Like I said, I would roll up a couple of those things just to get started and condense it to what's the story, the best story framework, and the most important key skills to delivering that story in that way, and packaging that together. So here's the difference maker in my mind, is that if I'm a salesperson, I typically won't remember everything you taught me about sales strategies and sales process. It's just not top of mind. So something has to bring it to life when I find myself in that situation. I call it deficit learning. I learn best when I'm in a deficit. I need to learn it now because I'm in the situation now. So what we've been trying to do is package up the story and skills coaching videos for how to tell that particular story, so that all you got to dial up is, which story do I have to tell? The disruptive differentiating one, why change, why now? Or the renewal expanding one, because I'm with an existing customer. And then as you get your messages, you get your coaching, skills coaching reinforcement for how to tell that particular story. You can spin yourself up very quickly. Instead of saying, do I remember my customer expansion strategy? Do I remember my customer acquisition strategy? We're saying this stuff actually has to be served up just in time, in an all-inclusive sort of experience for that moment, because frankly, that's when a salesperson is going to learn. They're going to learn in the moment they need to learn. They're not going to learn it ahead of time and hope they remember it. I hope that made sense.
Mm-hmm.
I would just simply say, research shows that high performers are usually keying in on 5 to 6 different factors in order to identify a situation. So if you were to ask us a top performer, tell me how you sort of define one situation from another, as they start talking, they tend to identify 5 to 6 factors. And they are very accurate then at being able to then measure and assess that a given opportunity against those factors. And so I would argue the answer is, Jason, and again, this is kind of where we use the research process to help us identify that, but it's getting into an organization and figuring out what is the right level of detail, what are high performers using, and how granular are they. And Tim's point about technology being helpful here is a good one, because what we've seen companies do is then they take those factors, they load them into a CRM or a software tool that allows a salesperson to just answer 7 or 5 to 6 quick questions about an opportunity, and the system actually spits back and says, hey, sounds like you're dealing with a blank situation 1, and oh, by the way, if you want to see some coaching tips on how to get through this situation, click here. And that's where sort of the strategy playbook stuff pops up and goes in front of them. So to me, we haven't touched on it much, but technology can be a huge enabler here in situational selling, helping people sort of answer a few simple questions, get a situation returned to them, and then some coaching advice put in. So I would argue as technology evolves, we'll be able to get more and more detailed around situations. But for now, it's what are your high performers looking at should be what the rest of the sales force looks at.
Well, let me just ask one more question, because you're playing right into this. So the question is, how do you incorporate several situations into standard sales stages in a CRM system and then forecast accurately? So I think it's a lot of these questions are going in the same direction, which is how do you implement this practically? And so it sounds like you've had some experience with this, Leff, working with CRM systems to try to enable this type of selling. So how does that tinker or mess up the stages in a pipeline, for the purposes of developing a forecast?
Yeah, so I'm not sure the situation and the stage of the sales process are the same thing. And what I mean by that is the situation is defined by what's going on the customer side of the fence, at least in my view. And then the stages are then what are we going to do to attack that, say in stage 1, stage 2, stage 2. I would argue the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 of a CRM are just the steps of the strategy we should use. Now, what needs to happen though is those need to be dynamic. So if it's situation 1, the prescription I'm getting to do in stage 1 versus stage 2 versus stage 3 should be different than if I'm dealing with a situation 2 and those stages. Because again, this is back to that rigidness problem. CRM can be very much a reinforcer of being too rigid, because if I pull it up and my stages are the same no matter what the situation, then I'm reinforcing a one size fits all. So I guess what I'm saying is we need to push our CRM systems, and they can do it, be flexible and adaptable to say, let's first define the situation, then show the steps of stages that we want someone to move through. But the situation and the sales stages are not the same thing. The sales stages are what we're going to do once we've defined the situation.
Okay. Well, let me bring this to a close here. This has been really fascinating, and as a researcher, I say that with data, almost no one has dropped off of this seminar, so to speak. So had a lot of interest and lots of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. Let me just point out that if you want to hear more from CVI, here's on the screen a free ebook that you can download. I've actually seen the ebook; it's great. I would encourage you to get it. And from Vantage Point's perspective, anyone who's registered will be sending out a link to the webinar and probably include some goodies in that as well. So if you're interested in learning more, visit Vantage Point's website, visit Corporate Vision's website, and let me again just give a sincere thanks to 2 real experts in the field. I found this great. So Leff and Tim, thanks for joining us.